Hello, Chapel High School students. My name is Joe. I get to lead our student ministry at our Norwalk campus. This is the final week of our series, What to Do When You Don't Know What to Do. Let me start us off with prayer. God, we want to know what to do when we don't know what to do, and we want to know what you want us to do. God, help us to love like you, to live like you, and to forgive like you. So I pray that we would learn, God, from your word this time, Lord, how to forgive. Lord, how to go from payback to reconciliation. So I pray that you would open our hearts, that you would open our minds, and that you would continue to change us to be more like you. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so I got a question. I want to know, I want you to think about this. Have you ever had a time where you were at a restaurant, like Taco Bell, you were hanging out, and you didn't order any food because you said you weren't hungry, but you have that friend who noticed, and they know that you didn't order any food, not because you weren't hungry, but just because you didn't have any money. So they're super cool. They got you some tacos or a Crunch Wrap and a Baja Blast, and you're like, hey, thank you so much. I'll pay you back as soon as possible. And they're like, don't worry about it. This one is on me. That's the best, right? That is awesome. I've had that happen to me before. It's wonderful. Not having to pay someone back is very heartwarming when it comes to something like tacos and Baja Blast. But other times, it can be a little bit complicated, right? Because outside of paying money back to someone, the idea of payback also comes up when someone hurts us. Let me give you some examples. When someone talks about us behind our back, we want payback, right? That's not right. Or when someone flirts with our girlfriend or boyfriend, we want payback. When someone fails to text us back or invite us to a group outing, we want payback for those things. And in those moments, when we're hurt, we want payback. We want them to feel the pain that we felt, or we want them to feel the embarrassment that we've felt. Our reaction is almost always to get even. We want justice in those times, right? For most of us, payback comes in one of three ways. Public payback, where maybe somebody talks bad about you, so you talk bad about them in front of everyone. This is when we pay them back for what they did in a very obvious way. Maybe you roast them in front of everybody. There's passive payback, which is a little bit more insidious. It's a little bit more subtle. We make comments that aren't obviously hurtful, but could be interpreted that way. We put a subtle, vague post on social media that we don't mention them, but everybody knows it's about them, and so we're just being cowardly by not actually putting their name directly on there or direct messaging them. We roll our eyes when someone talks to us, or we ignore someone's texts. And then there's imaginary payback, which I'm very good at. This is when you have imaginary conversations in your head. These are the shower arguments that you have, where you come up with the best comeback, the most clever argument, the best insult, whatever it is, and it takes over our thoughts, but we never actually do anything about it. And then there's perhaps the most satisfying payback of all, if we're honest, and that's enjoy watching that other person fail. Like when your ex broke up with you for someone else, and then that person dumps them. Or your mom snaps at you and hurts your feelings. Later she realizes she was in the wrong, and so she's crying and apologizing to you. Or the guy who made fun of us in third grade, now that you're in high school, you realize, if you're honest, you still don't like him. He trips and falls in gym class or the pep rally in front of everybody, and he gets embarrassed. In those moments, it feels like justice, doesn't it? It feels good to see someone who gets what's coming to them. And that's exactly the sort of situation that we find Joseph in this week. So if you're just tuning in, we've been talking about the life of Joseph for the past few weeks, and his life was crazy, all right? His life, the account of his life can be found in the book of Genesis, and his story is a wild one. It's oftentimes he had no idea what to do next in his life. So early in this series, we talked about how Joseph knew that he was his dad's favorite, and he rubbed that in his brother's face. He also had dreams where he was in charge of his entire family over his brothers and everybody, and then he told his older brothers about this. Not exactly the most self-aware guy. And since Joseph was super annoying, his brothers plotted to kill him, which is just a bit of an overreaction. But instead of killing him, when they're out, they see a group of travelers and they decide to make a little money, so they sell Joseph into slavery instead. And then the rest of this series has covered Joseph as a slave in Egypt, Joseph as a slave in prison in Egypt, and Joseph as a man who could interpret dreams being restored, being brought out of prison and then placed in Pharaoh's house, who was king over Egypt, and then Joseph becoming one of the most powerful men in Egypt. He actually was second in command over all of the country. And not a bad outcome for a kid who had gotten sold into slavery by his brothers. But then there's a plot twist. All right, another one. So after Joseph is put in second in command, there's a food shortage in all of this area and where Joseph's family lived. So Joseph's dad, Jacob, sends his brothers to Egypt to ask for food because their country was out and they were starving. And at this point in the story, Joseph's family thought that Joseph was obviously dead, right? So they had no thoughts about the possibility of seeing Joseph as they go to Egypt. When they arrive in Egypt, and saw Joseph, not knowing it was Joseph, a huge drama unfolded. And so let's pick it up. You can find this in Genesis chapter 45. It says, "Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all of his attendants." So Joseph is there standing in front of his brothers, and his brothers don't know that it's him. And he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Genesis 45, chapters 1 through 3. So imagine the tension in the moment where Joseph is face to face with the people who tried to kill him. His own brothers who sold him into slavery, the same brothers who are ironically now asking him for help. This was a get what's coming to you moment. All right, everything was set up so perfectly. It was time for Joseph to get his payback. Joseph could have refused them food, which meant that they would have starved to death. He could have had them thrown into prison, maybe given them a taste of their own medicine. He could have had them killed, which they were certainly willing to do. I mean, what would you do in this situation? Honestly, think about it. You know, what would you have done with all of that power to be able to hurt the person or the people who hurt you the most? You know, honestly, I don't know. And as the story continues, Joseph asks his brothers to come and stand close to him. And you can just imagine the terror that his brothers felt in this moment. And then Joseph says this, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." So Joseph didn't get payback. All right, and there was only one reason that he could have responded the way that he did. He had to have previously let go the idea of revenge. This wasn't something he decided right now. He had already done the hard work of forgiving his brothers. How do we know that? Because Joseph could look in the eyes of the ones who had caused him the most grief, and he had cared about how they were feeling. When Joseph said, "Do not be distressed, do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here," he was acknowledging their wrong and his hurt without creating more hurt, without making it worse, without creating more division. And only a healed person, someone who had already forgiven, could do this. Joseph chose forgiveness instead of payback, and we see that the moment when he had the greatest opportunity for payback, for revenge. Somewhere between being sold into slavery and being reunited with his brothers, Joseph did the hard work of giving his hurt to God and allowing God to be central in his healing. And that's why Joseph was quick to acknowledge God in the area where his brothers had caused him the most pain. And it didn't make what his brothers did okay. It didn't minimize it, and it didn't make Joseph's pain any less. It just took the pain and the hurt, and it no longer put them at the center stage. It put God there instead, and that made forgiveness possible. And here's the cool thing, is that forgiveness was not only for his brothers, it was freedom from Joseph's pain too. Joseph ends up going to tell his brothers to get their father and their entire family and move to Egypt because his family was going to continue. And without making this move, his family would suffer. And then this happened. And he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterwards, his brothers talked to him. This is a beautiful picture of the only thing that's better than payback, which is reconciliation. This is where we see God do the impossible in a relationship, to bring peace where there had only been hurt, all because of forgiveness. You know, when it comes to other people hurting us, we too have the opportunity to choose something better than payback. In fact, here's a simple way to remember it. When you don't know what to do, pursue peace instead of payback. When you pursue peace, you fight for the relationship. In other words, you fight, you can fight to win, you can fight to be right, you can fight to prove your point, or you can fight the urge to bring payback and pursue peace. But you can't do both. You can choose that the relationship is more important than payback. The relationship is more important than you proving your point or you being right. Joseph preserved his relationship with his brothers, and he preserved his family because he chose peace. And he was only able to do that because of forgiveness. And he was only able to forgive with the help of God. Joseph didn't have some forgiveness superpower that allowed him to do this. He just had the determination to do the work that peace required, and an understanding of God working in a situation, which means that you and I can do this too. You know, when you pursue peace, you lay down your right to get payback. You let go of revenge. You say goodbye to your desire to get even. And instead, you choose the path of forgiveness. You choose God's story of reconciliation instead of your own story of payback and revenge. Now, obviously, this is easier said than done. But there is a reward for you too. Because not only will you have peace with those who've hurt you, you will have peace inside yourself as well. Because you may be so angry. You may be so frustrated at someone. And who is that hurting? Do you think, the other person may be living their life completely oblivious to the fact that you're still angry, and yet it still affects your life. They still have power over you because you're choosing to not forgive them. Here's also why this can be complicated. Because what happened to you isn't what happened to Joseph. In fact, I could tell you dozens of stories, and none of them would be exactly like yours. And maybe you've spent this time wondering, well, do I always have to reconcile? What about when it's toxic? What about if I'm the one who did the hurting? Each of us have a unique and complicated situation, and figuring out what it looks like to pursue peace isn't easy. And so what I want to do is I want to leave you with 3 things that you can do to help you to understand what it may look like for you to pursue peace. Ask yourself this: what do you need to decide? Do you need to choose to forgive? Who do you need to forgive? And lastly, what offense do you need to bring before God? What maybe have you done where somebody else owes you forgiveness, but you haven't decided to go before them and to apologize what you've done? God can do incredible things in your story that you might not even possibly be able to imagine yet. He can bring reconciliation and forgiveness into some of the worst situations. I've seen it in my life. And so, as we close this series, remember this: when you don't know what to do, pursue peace instead of payback.